Good morning, everyone. Good morning, ma'am. I am Janessa Alcandilario, and I will discuss about the gender-based violence, survivor, victim, perpetrator, and human rights. But before we proceed to our main topic, let us first know what are the learning objectives of this lesson. When you finish reading this chapter, you should be able to: number 1, understand the definition of gender-based violence, other related terms and its forms and consequences. Number 2, understand gender-based violence as a human rights issue. Number 3, determine the relationship between human rights and gender-based violence. And number 4, differentiate perpetrators, survivors, and victims in gender-based violence. And now for the introduction. Gender-based violence is one of the most widespread and human rights abuses, but least recognized in the world. It refers to any harm perpetrated against a person's will on the basis of gender, the socially ascribed differences between males and females. In the Philippines, gender-based violence has clearly been placed in the realm of women's human rights over the past decade. Prior to 1993, most governments regarded violence against women largely as a private matter between individuals. Gender-based violence cuts across public and private spheres, including home, school, and work, and takes place during peacetime and conflict. It is both a human rights and a development issue, with negative consequences for both women and men. So as you can see, gender-based violence has devastating consequences not only for victims but also for society as a whole. It results in physical, sexual, and psychological harm to both men and women, largely as a private matter between individuals. Now, speaking of its devastating effects, let us now talk about the consequences of gender-based violence. The consequences of gender-based violence include serious, immediate, and long-term impacts on the sexual, physical, and psychological health of survivors. The first consequence of gender-based violence is health consequences that include unwanted pregnancies, complications from unsafe abortions, sexually transmitted infections including HIV, injuries, mental health, and psychosocial effects like depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, suicide, and death. Violence also affects children's survival, development, and school participation. In other words, the negative effects of gender-based violence drastically affects the physical as well as the mental well-being of the survivors. So from here, we can easily discern that its consequences in terms of health can be lethal. Now let's move on to the social consequences. Social consequences extend to families and communities. Families can also be stigmatized as a consequence of gender-based violence. For example, when children are born following a rape, or if family members choose to stand by a survivor, fellow members of their community may avoid them. Many survivors of gender-based violence felt shame and isolated. They tend to think that they are bad, dirty, or permanently flawed. They feel that they do not deserve support, that they tainted, and that others will not want to be their friends or lovers. Also, survivors along with their families may have been avoided by the community, and that's where the social consequences of gender-based violence takes place. And lastly, economic consequences include the cost of public health and social welfare systems and the reduced ability of many survivors to participate in social and economic life. So the economic consequences of gender-based violence results in lost employment and productivity, and it drains resources from social services, the justice system, healthcare agencies, and employers. As such, the negative effects of gender-based violence in terms in economic is a clear barrier to sustainable development. At this moment, let us now know the definition of survivor, victim, and perpetrator. Survivor is the preferred term, not a victim of a person who has lived through an incident of gender-based violence, while a perpetrator is a person, group, or institution that inflicts, supports, or condones violence or other abuses against a person or group of persons. The characteristics of perpetrators include persons with real or perceived power, persons in decision-making positions, and persons in authority. Basically, a victim is defined by the harm that has come to them. They are the ones who has been destroyed and mistreated, whereas a survivor is defined by the life afterwards. They are the ones who reclaim their power after a bad incident like gender-based violence. On the other hand, perpetrators, or known as the wrongdoers, are those who committed a crime or a violent and harmful act that still support the violence of others. And now, let us know what is human rights. Human rights are universal, inalienable, indivisible, interconnected, and interdependent. Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. Human rights also include the right to life and liberty, freedom from slavery and torture, and freedom of opinion and expression, the right to work and education, and many more. Everyone is entitled to these rights without discrimination. Prevention of and response to gender-based violence is directly linked to the protection of human rights. Acts of gender-based violence violate a number of human rights principles enshrined in international human rights instruments and in our Philippine Constitution. These include the following amongst others: the right to life, liberty, and property of persons, the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, the right to freedom from torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, the right to freedom of opinion and expression, and to education. So let us remember that gender-based violence is a human rights violation since it is an unrelenting assault on human dignity. Human rights is the only hope of those victims and survivors of gender-based violence because they are an important means of protection for them and even us who never experienced the feeling of abuse, neglect, and isolation. And that's the end of my report. Thank you so much for listening and have a good day.